Christopher Columbus spent decades in agonising pain that ultimately led to his demise. Doctors attributed his death to gout, but modern historians now suggest a more disturbing cause for his death. Columbus has a legacy full of the highs and lows of over 500 years of history, yet for all his fame and infamy, few people still know the whole story, or just how dark it gets. Born in 1451 to Genoese wool weaver Domenico Colombo, from what historians can tell, Christopher Columbus had a standard upbringing for a merchant's son in the Republic of Genoa. Nonetheless, he always had his eye on the next rung of the ladder. By the late 1470s, when he was still in his 20s, he was travelling around Europe trading for the wealthiest families in the Republic. In 1479, Columbus made an extremely advantageous alliance. He married Filipa Moniz Perestrello, the well-to-do daughter of a Portuguese Knight of the Order of Santiago. Through her father, Filipa even had connections to Prince John of Portugal and Prince Henry the Navigator. It was quite the rise for a merchant's son, but though Columbus was very aware of her social standing, he was also aware that she was past her prime at around 25 years old, and that her widowed mother didn't have much money. Although Filipa gave him a son, Diego, soon after their marriage, Columbus wasn't around to watch the boy grow up. In the 1480s, he left their home and pushed his trading to the west coast of Africa, travelling as far as present-day Ghana to sell his wares. When he returned from his African adventures, he received chilling news. His wife Filipa, who wasn't yet 30, had died from an unknown cause. Never one to let a deal lie on the table, Columbus settled her affairs, got his money, and took his young son under his care. He was always looking for new ways to make his name, and in the early 1480s he had a novel idea. Europeans had long gotten rich using the Silk Road to trade with the East, but Columbus was convinced that going west, and by sea, was the best way to reach Asia. Recent sea expeditions taking an alternative route around Africa to Asia only hardened his resolve to get glory his way. Besides, he had other motives. Columbus was obsessed with gold, and viewed his obsession as a kind of holy mission. As he wrote, he dreamed of getting gold in such quantity that the sovereigns will undertake and prepare to go conquer the Holy Sepulchre, and the explorer frequently talked of converting the entire world to Christianity. For Columbus, a sea-going Silk Road via the west was the best way to get both gold and acolytes. To go west, Columbus first had to convince a patron to fund his journey, and this meant coming up with a convincing plan for the expedition. This is where Columbus made his biggest mistake. Contrary to popular belief, people of Columbus's time were well aware that the Earth was round, and several relatively accurate calculations of the Earth's size had been around since antiquity. But Columbus tended toward the wrong theories, leading him to underestimate the Earth's size by a third in his proposals. When he presented the project to King John II of Portugal, the king's advisors immediately rejected it because his math was so clearly off. Even they understood that the true voyage to the Far East from the Western Passage would be far too long for any 15th century ship to take. Before long, no one wanted anything to do with Columbus's far-fetched plan, but this is where his cunning and persistence paid off. Around the same time as his rejection from the King of Portugal, Columbus also sought patronage from King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. Unsurprisingly, their committee also dismissed the idea as silly, but the monarchs still gave Columbus a small allowance, keeping him on a kind of retainer to prevent another kingdom from getting lucky on his wild bet. In 1487, Columbus was in Cordoba as part of his bid to convince Ferdinand and Isabella of his proposal. It's likely that during this time, Columbus, in his mid-30s, met the 20-year-old orphaned Beatriz Enriquez de Arana and took her as his mistress. A short time after their meeting, Beatriz gave birth to Columbus's illegitimate son, and Columbus somehow managed to turn this into a professional opportunity. After recognising the child as his own, Columbus named the baby Fernando, a transparent bid to get King Ferdinand on his side. In January of 1492, Columbus's moment finally came. Ferdinand and Isabella had been fighting an expensive conflict with the Moors on the Iberian Peninsula and had just conquered Granada, the last Muslim fortress in the area. Columbus understood that the monarchs would be both flush with victory and eager to gain an advantage over other European countries for trade with the East. Yet again, he presented Ferdinand and Isabella with his plans to travel west and bring back riches, and this time they took the leap. In April of 1492, they gave him full funding for the voyage and, should he succeed, a host of promises. Upon finding a passage, Columbus was to become the governor of any new lands Spain could claim, and was also entitled to a tenth of those lands' revenues. In early August, Columbus departed Spain with the Santa Maria, the Pinta and the Nina and headed west. 5 weeks later, in the early morning hours of October 12th, they spotted land. Columbus and his crew had landed on the island of Guanahani in the middle of the Bahamas and called it San Salvador, or Holy Saviour. When he met the Lucayan, Taino and Arawak peoples of the island, he noted that they should be good and intelligent servants, and when he spotted their gold earrings, he demanded that they take him to their source of gold. Thanks in part to his shoddy calculations, Columbus maintained that he'd landed somewhere in the Indies, and so incorrectly referred to the indigenous people as Indians throughout his voyages. He would continue to believe they were Indians for the rest of his life, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Columbus spent this first voyage trawling around the various islands of the Bahamas, trading with some indigenous peoples while taking others as prisoners. He left around 40 settlers on the island of Hispaniola to build a fort, then began the voyage back to Spain. Columbus was still a relatively young man, but a seafaring life was punishing. Just before reaching Spain, the fleet hit a raging storm, and it triggered a catastrophe. During the melee, Columbus suffered an attack of what he believed was gout, which left him nearly debilitated and which would plague him for years. After returning to Spain in March of 1493, Ferdinand and Isabella greeted Columbus in Barcelona with celebrations fit for a hero. He returned the favour by presenting them with slaves he'd captured along with various items from this new world. Barely half a year after arriving back in Spain, Columbus was making his second voyage to what he still thought was Asia. After discovering several new islands, he returned to where he'd left his men in Hispaniola, only to find their fortress was now an empty ruin. Columbus learned from a local tribe leader that after fighting over gold and then kidnapping local women, a chieftain had taken revenge by burning down the fort and killing everyone in it. Columbus's first journey had been exploratory, but now it was time to put the unruly locals and colonists alike under his thumb. While he went off exploring Cuba, he put men in charge of Hispaniola and told them to get the island under Spanish control. When he returned 4 months later, he walked into chaos. In his absence, his proxies had laid waste to the indigenous population, taking women at their will and turning members of the tribe into their personal servants. In response, the indigenous people had risen up and killed some of the Spanish, and the two sides were now preparing for all-out war. Columbus took this as a sign to exert even more control, and he went full force into oppressing the indigenous population. Over the next years, Columbus oversaw a deluge of horrors. He would personally give indigenous women to his men, some of them girls aged 9 or 10. He was only a little kinder to the Spaniards who crossed him. He once ordered a woman's tongue cut out because she'd spoken ill of him and his family, and cut off a man's ears and nose for stealing corn. Columbus's power trip was in full swing. He returned to Spain in March of 1496, laden with gold and slaves. Once more, despite some brewing doubts about where exactly this new world was in Asia, he was greeted largely as a hero. Since his first attack of apparent gout, Columbus had begun to suffer from other worrying symptoms, including influenza-like fevers and, most alarmingly, bleeding from his eyes and periods of blindness. All the same, he crossed the ocean for a third time, desperate to bring the tribes in Hispaniola to heel. When Columbus returned to the island, he was met with a nasty surprise. Now it wasn't just the indigenous population chafing against him. Some of the settlers grew restless and rose up, angry that the wealth he'd promised them was nowhere to be found. In response, Columbus tried them for disobedience, hanging at least one of their leaders. In October of 1499, just over 7 years since his first voyage west, Columbus sent word to Spain, begging Ferdinand and Isabella to appoint a royal commissioner to help govern Hispaniola. Columbus was doing such a poor job of governing in the New World that rumours had already reached the king and queen about his brutality and incompetence, and they sent envoy Francisco de Bobadilla immediately. When he landed in Santo Domingo, locals' testimony quickly confirmed that the rumours were true. In response, he seized Columbus's property, moved into his house, and declared himself governor. In October of 1500, aware of the investigations against him, Columbus presented himself to Bobadilla, who put him in chains and sent him back to Spain to face justice. The great Christopher Columbus now spent 6 brutal weeks behind bars for his reported mismanagement of the colonies. Eventually, he was hauled out in front of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella at their palace in Granada to defend himself against the accusations. The monarchs believed his version of events and, more than that, deplored Bobadilla's unilateral decisions. In practically just one meeting, they recalled Bobadilla from the colonies, restored Columbus's wealth and property, and most miraculous of all, agreed to fund a 4th voyage. In 1502, Columbus embarked on his final voyage west. While travelling around the islands, storms battered Columbus's ships. Finally, in June 1503, his fleet could go no further, and their damaged vessels washed up in Jamaica. Columbus anxiously sent out 2 of his men and a crew of indigenous people to paddle a canoe to Hispaniola for help. The newly appointed governor of Hispaniola, Nicolas de Ovando y Cáceres, had taken his predecessor Bobadilla's view on Columbus and had no love lost for the explorer. Accordingly, he revelled in the idea of Columbus being stranded on Jamaica and delayed and obstructed any efforts to rescue his crew. As the months dragged on with no end in sight, Columbus got desperate. In order to woo and wow the local tribes, he used astronomical charts to predict an upcoming lunar eclipse. It worked well enough for the impressed tribes to provision the men with sustenance. Columbus and his crew were beached for a year before they were rescued in June of 1504. Columbus gave up on the cursed 4th voyage and landed back in Spain that November. Soon after, he learned that the crown had betrayed him. Although the Spanish monarchs had promised him 1/10 of the revenues from the New World, King Ferdinand now refused to pay, saying that since Columbus had been dismissed as governor, he wasn't entitled to anything. Less than 2 years later, an exhausted and sickly Columbus was on his deathbed, racked with agony from the symptoms of gout he'd experienced for decades. On May 20th, 1506, he died at the age of 54. For better or worse, Columbus is an enormous symbol of America today, but for centuries after his death, he was almost entirely forgotten. After all, even in his own lifetime, people were suspicious that he'd ever reached Asia, and all too many knew how badly he'd failed as governor and how brutally he'd treated his subjects. But there is one thing about Columbus that historians still argue about. His bouts of illness were attributed to gout at the time, but modern historians suggest he likely suffered from reactive arthritis, which can cause similar symptoms, and which is contracted through intestinal bacterial infections or through STDs. Indeed, one historian believes they know exactly how Columbus got it. According to Frank Arnett, a rheumatologist who worked with historian Charles Merrill, Columbus likely contracted reactive arthritis from food poisoning on one of his many sea voyages, falling victim to poor sanitation and improper food preparation. To add insult to injury, we now know he wasn't even the first European to reach America. Leif Erikson and the Vikings managed it hundreds of years before Columbus was born. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.